Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
A date which will live in infamy. I Am an American Too, a film by Khachik
and Atticus Motes. War broke out between Japan and the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This attack surprised many Americans and Japanese Americans alike. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, American citizens were fearful of Japanese Americans because they were considered possible spies from the Japanese Empire who might sabotage and defeat America in World War II. This led to discrimination by the rest of America against the Japanese Americans, who overwhelmingly were loyal to the United States. 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, giving the U.S. Army the right to relocate any person in America that was deemed dangerous to the nation. This allowed Japanese Americans located on the West Coast to be forced into internment camps for the protection of the nation. The government was able to pass this executive order because of the necessary and proper clause, which stated the president can create any law as long as it is beneficial for the people and the nation. We are at war. The government also claimed this was for the protection of the Japanese Americans who were threatened by American civilians in their hometowns. For example, some civilians took their own actions and harassed Japanese Americans. Anti-Japanese American organizations popped up around the West Coast and had anti-Japanese American rallies to remove all Japanese Americans from U.S. soil. Grocery stores, barbershops, and other common places placed signs in their windows to exclude the Japanese Americans from the American society. Therefore, the U.S. government stated that placing the Japanese Americans in internment camps was to protect them from the rest of the American citizens. This was not the only time the U.S. had created laws and regulations to restrict Japanese Americans in America. When Japanese were immigrating into the Hawaiian Islands, they were taking a multitude of American jobs, so the U.S. and Japan created a deal called the Gentleman's Agreement. It was passed in 1907 and restricted the Japanese government from giving passports to immigrants looking for labor. Also, the Alien Land Law of 1913 prohibited Japanese from purchasing land and acquiring leases longer than 3 years. Before the 1967 Supreme Court decision, interracial marriage was outlawed in many states, and so some Japanese Americans were not allowed to marry outside their race. In American films such as Patriot in 1917, the Japanese were portrayed as sneaky, treacherous, and untrustworthy. Saturday Evening Post writers Peter Kine and Wallace Irwin stated that Japanese Americans should never own land because their race would gain too much power in the U.S. Although it is true that the U.S. was at war and there was much discrimination against the Japanese Americans, the Japanese American citizens expected the rights to be guaranteed as stated in the Constitution.
Japanese Americans did not receive their Fourth Amendment rights when FBI agents searched Japanese American homes and persons without a warrant. The U.S. government justified this action by claiming it was protecting the nation against espionage. When it was confirmed an American family had any Japanese background, they were immediately sent to internment camps and given only 48 hours to evacuate their homes, thus removing them from their jobs and communities, splitting apart their families, and freezing their Japanese bank accounts for the protection of the nation. Their rights under the Sixth Amendment of due process were denied. Also, they were not given a fair trial or even charged with the crime before being imprisoned in internment camps. America was also fighting Germany and Italy in World War II, but German and Italian Americans' rights were not taken away like the rights of Japanese Americans. The internment camps forced the Japanese Americans to live in conditions of a prison and were constantly at gunpoint, surrounded by armed guards. If an internee came too close to the barbed wire fence, the guard was allowed to fire at will. The conditions of the camp were treacherous, with ill-prepared and unrefrigerated food. Many of the internees became sick with food poisoning and had constant diarrhea and vomited. The Japanese Americans were given small shacks to live in, along with other strangers. This treatment of the Japanese Americans is completely forbidden under the 8th Amendment regarding cruel and unusual punishment. In 1944, Mitsuo Endo, a Japanese American woman, challenged the constitutionality of the internment camps with a series of cases. Finally, the last case went to the Supreme Court and ended with her winning the case. Following the case, exclusion orders were expunged and the Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the camps. Then, the US government began to re-enter the Japanese Americans into society. The transition was difficult and awkward, as stated by the author of Farewell to Manzanar. Jean Wakatsuki Houston stated that white Americans treated Japanese Americans rudely, and she felt it was her fault for being a burden on the white American citizens. Many Japanese Americans did not want to leave camps because it was safer than returning to the hostile white Americans on the West Coast. Joe Nishimura was a loyal Japanese American citizen who was one of the lucky internees to leave early and go to college in Nebraska. Despite being placed in a Japanese internment camp, he graduated college as an engineer and was re-entered into society, adjusting to his new way of life. Finally, 40 years later, in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was ratified by Congress and signed by President Ronald Reagan, which granted Japanese Americans who were interned $20,000. In 1990, the Japanese Americans officially received a letter of apology and $20,000 compensation during George Bush's presidency. Still, many Japanese Americans had already died and could not receive this payment. As Bill Shishima, a Japanese American internee, said, "This $20,000 payment and letter of apology was not worth having 3 years of my life taken away." George T. Sakato is the final living recipient of the Medal of Honor during World War II in the all-Japanese American 442nd Regiment. He fought honorably and bravely for his country, but because Americans feared people of Japanese heritage, he was treated as an outcast and lost his rights he solely deserved.
In an interview with 95-year-old Beulah Beck and 92-year-old Mary Patton, who lived in Pasadena in 1941, both stated they were terrified of another attack similar to Pearl Harbor. Mary and Beulah were not hostile towards the Japanese Americans, but feared they may assist Japan in World War II. The US government used this fear to pass the executive order interning Japanese Americans. It was the US government's responsibility to protect the Japanese Americans' rights as guaranteed in the Constitution. Not a single Japanese American was convicted of a crime against the US government during World War II. Fear is no reason to take away the rights of any American, whether they are part of the majority or a part of the minority. It was the government's responsibility to protect the rights of Japanese Americans, and in this instance, the government failed to do so. The day the government ordered the rights of the Japanese Americans to be excluded because of their nationality will be a date which will live forever in infamy.